How's everyone feeling? Yeah? Sessions 1 through 3 have been good? Good, this is going to be better, don't worry. I am delighted to be here with you, Anjan. I have to say, I finished reading Breakup on my flight here, and I'm a very nervous flyer, but I wasn't nervous because your book was so much more frightening than the flight that I was on. You have had an extraordinary career. Your 3 books take us from your reporting in the Democratic Republic of Congo to Rwanda to the Central African Republic. Tell us how it all began.
Oh, sure. So I guess I was a student of mathematics. I was studying math at Yale, and I had a job. I had a job at Goldman Sachs to be a quant, mathematician at the bank, and I was in the lunch hall one day, and I opened the newspaper, the New York Times, and there was, in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a little article that said 4 million people had died and in this war, and I didn't understand why this wasn't on the front page. And so it sort of was in my mind, and then I was paying my final bill at Yale, and the cashier happened to be African, so I asked her where she was from. She said Zaire, the old name for Congo. And then I said, oh, I might go to Congo. I might go to Zaire. And she said, oh, you stupid Yale kids. You think you think you can go to Congo? You can't even sign a check. I could steal all your money. You get robbed or killed. What are you thinking? And so she had a second job on Chapel Street at a parking lot. And so I would go there every night, and I would buy her Dunkin' Donuts milkshakes. And in the end, she agreed for me to stay with her in-laws in Kinshasa. So I bought a one-way ticket, and I showed up there. I had no journalistic experience. I just sort of never written a piece in my life, and I kind of showed up in Kinshasa with this idea that I was going to make myself a journalist, and was going to write stories that needed to be told and needed to receive more attention. And I would learn about this great war.
What was it about that headline that stopped you? Because so many college-age students in particular might see a headline like that and think, well, I have to worry about what I'm reading for class today, or what party I'm going to this weekend, or indeed cashing that check. So what was it about the headline that motivated you to do something this extraordinary? I
think, I remember the piece, and I believe it might have been, I don't quite remember, but I believe it might have been about by a reporter whose name is Brian Miller, who was the AP correspondent in Congo. It was such a small piece. The brevity of the piece shocked me. It spoke of events so large, 4 million dead, famine, refugees, rebellions, and yet the piece was, I believe, might have been 200 words. And I thought, how can you speak of things so large in so few words? And that's what struck me. I thought to myself, there has to be more here. And I made some calls. I began to reach out to Yale alumni who were journalists, and I asked them for advice. And one of them was a man named Steve Brill, who started Court TV. And I took the train to New York, and I went up, this giant skyscraper. And he was late for his meeting because somebody else, something more important, obviously, had come up. And his secretary was Polish, and she felt bad for me. And she came up to me and she said, I saw your email to Mr. Brill. So I thought, and I'm sorry that he can't make the meeting right now, but I thought you should have this. And she gave me an interview of Ryszard Kapuscinski, the great Polish journalist, in Granta magazine. And I'd heard of him, and I hadn't read the interview, so I just put it in my pocket, met Mr. Brill, and on the train back to New Haven, read the interview, and it blew my mind. It just, Kapuscinski spoke about being in Central Africa, or across Africa, in the 60s and 70s, witnessing coups d'etats, revolutions. He said human history was unfolding before my eyes. And yet, where were the poets, where were the writers, where were the philosophers? These people who, write about the human condition, It was just me and a couple of blokes, like, journalists, no real training. And that's what he said. And then he said, then I went back to Paris or Europe, and then I found all the writers there. And I read this, and I called up a couple of former foreign correspondents and asked them, is it still the same? And they said, absolutely. There's news, and Kinshasa is like, there's always news, and there's not enough reporters. And I thought, if there's not much competition, that's where I'm going to go, and, start my career.
Yeah. So you wanted to bear witness to these momentous events that nobody else was really paying attention to, or not paying attention to in the right ways. But you get there, you're fresh out of college, you have no journalism training whatsoever. How did you learn what you had to learn in order to bear witness in the way that you do across your books?
So that impulse, that little step that I took to go to Kinshasa now has become a career. That's what I've been doing, and now I'm based in Mexico. I'm always looking for these stories that I feel aren't getting enough attention in the mainstream press, and to which I can make some kind of contribution and feel useful. That's a big part of it for me. But in Kinshasa, when I showed up, I was living in Annie, the cashier at Yale, her in-laws' house, and Nana, the mother of the household. I wasn't able to pay my rent the first month, and so I was struggling to pay my rent. And then she sat me down one day and she said, "What did you study?" And I said, "Mathematics." She said, "You idiot! Of course you can't write a story. What's wrong with you?" She's like, well, "Who did my sister-in-law send me? This is a bad deal. Like, you're never going to publish anything. You're never going to get any stories." So it was hard. And so the first stories, I remember, I was looking at the Reuters stories, to be honest. I was looking at the Reuters stories, and I was like trying to understand how they structured their stories and trying to imitate their story, and making my own calls, doing my own research. And I remember I met the Reuters correspondent there, and I asked him if there were any jobs, and he said, "Oh, the AP correspondent just quit, and AP cut the position. So there's news, and the AP still wants news, but they don't have anyone here. So write to them." And I wrote to the AP editor on a Sunday afternoon, and he replied in 10 minutes, and he said, "Who the hell are you, and what the hell are you doing in Kinshasa? I have no reason not to believe you, but this is crazy." And so...
Did you tell him you were bumming around not paying your rent? Or,
exactly, yeah. It turned out he knew somebody that I'd reached out to for advice, a Yale alumnus, and so I got lucky there. Somebody to vouch for me who had spoken to me for the last 2 months at least, and could say, Anjan's, he's really a journalist. He's really trying to be a journalist here, and it was a struggle. My first stories were all about plane crashes and boats sinking in Congo, and those events always make the news. And it took me a while to understand and learn how to write feature stories. And I began to travel across the country. The UN had a huge airline network, and they still do. My job is still available. Like, after I left, nobody's really gone back and taken my job.
If anyone's looking for a job,
I'm pitching.
You
I'm
have
pitching
a connection here. You have a connection here.
It's a great place to start a career. And you have free flights with the UN. The UN runs an airline network. It's the biggest in Africa, across Congo, and journalists get on the flights for free. So it was like a dream. I could pick whatever place I wanted to go to, and they would get me on these flights. And sometimes the flight was full, so you had to come back, but it's a free flight. So for a journalist starting out, it was perfect. And it's still possible.
There's a world of difference between the young college graduate trying to figure out how to make his way through the world as a journalist, and the husband and father that is narrating your most recent book, Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime. And I was wondering if I could ask you to read the first few pages for the audience, just so they can hear the difference in the way that you're describing the beginning of your career and where you are. I don't want to say now, because you're sort of reflecting in this book on things that have happened about 9 years ago or so, right? But just to measure the difference between what you're talking about and where we are.
Sure.
Here you go.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course.
No, that's interesting. I think it's interesting to read this exactly in that context of how I began, and it's sobering to think of the difference. So the first chapter is called Family, and I'll just read. I moved away from the world, and my family gave me refuge. In my wife's embrace, in the bliss of my home, I believed I could never again be alone, never again be helpless. In July 2013, I became a father. Raphael's birth reinforced our family. She looked fragile, so obviously mortal. She brought me new obligations as a father, to work and earn money. But she did far more. I looked down over her and lifted her up in my arms and thought she could not be all that I left behind of myself in the world. My work acquired a new significance. It became a way to nourish and shelter her, and also to take distance from her. I searched my past, seeking work to which I felt an old connection that had shaped me, and to which my link felt elemental, pure, necessary. The most isolated major war in the world was then underway in a country called the Central African Republic, among the world's most sparsely populated places. This conflict was perhaps even more deadly than the Syrian war, which at the time dominated newspaper headlines. But Central Africa, home to several long-running wars, rarely made the first page. I had learned journalism a decade before, just south of the Central African Republic. My first job out of college was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a stringer, a freelance journalist paid 10 US cents per published word for the US wire agency, the Associated Press. I learned a great deal more from the Rwandan reporters whom I taught as their government imprisoned them and even killed some of our colleagues. The obscurity of this new Central African war made it difficult to justify a trip to report on it. I needed to consider the costs for the flight and travel, and of journeying through an isolated terrain far from my family. My wife, Nat, and I were then in a fusional marriage. She had also worked as a war correspondent. We had met in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where she had managed a United Nations radio station on the war's northeastern frontline. Nat had helped me break some of my early war stories. From the front, she sent me intelligence about deadly attacks. I typed them up and emailed them to the Associated Press right as her radio station broadcast the story. Speed was paramount to a wire reporter, and Nat helped me, a rookie in Congo, outpace my competition. I had turned down a job on Wall Street to try and become a journalist in Congo, and those first published stories gave me the courage to stay there and cover the war. The initial trust between Nat and me bloomed into love and then marriage. Now we planned on growing old together, and our desire for a permanent attachment had led us to birth our wailing infant. I found it difficult to persuade magazine editors to commission a story. Which Central African Republic? They asked. The alternative was to finance the journey myself and hope that any payments I later received from one of these editors covered my costs. The war's obscurity was galling, not only for its great tumult or for its many unrecorded killings, but for its historical importance. This war marked a reversal of colonial history in Central Africa. The rebels who had taken over the country were mostly Muslim, and their victory marked the first Muslim rule here since powerful Muslim kingdoms were defeated by French armies in the late 19th century. Almost 100 years after the French established their brutal African colonies, Muslims still remembered their ancestors' humiliation and sought to recover glory. There was now talk of a religious conflict in the Central African Republic, of Christians rising up to fight their new Muslim rulers, of old grievances resurfacing, of an implicit and long unchallenged Christian dominance at stake. The winner ruled a land rich with gold, diamonds, and the ivory of forest elephants. And in part because it happened in Central Africa, in part because this region, nearby Congo, had been rife with war, in part because we easily dismiss violence as savagery, unworthy of our attention, this great war passed in relative obscurity. And then, the next scene, I guess I don't need to read it, but it's just it's my life. I can read maybe a couple just for the contrast. Mm-hmm. At the time, I lived with Nat and Raphael on Canada's Atlantic coast. Our town was called Shippigan, which meant passage of the ducks. Fewer than 1,000 families lived in the town, and everyone knew Nat's father had run the local school, and that her mother had worked at the post office. This close-knit and safe community was perfect for new parents, though its poverty made it unlikely we could stay indefinitely. Shippigan was a fishing town, and where its lobster and crab had once made it rich, it depended on government handouts now that the ocean was depleted. a university campus and marine laboratory were important employers, and a provincial aquarium attracted regional tourists. Yeah, so that was. And then I describe a phone call I made with, I spoke to Louis, my companion on this journey, who'd also worked in corporate America. He was a Human Rights Watch researcher in Rwanda. He was my close friend, and we, began to plan our journey. And he showed me some satellite photographs, and we sort of plan how we'll travel through the country.
Thank you for that. I think you deserve a round of applause just there. When I started reading Breakup, I was actually quite shocked by the first page. I think it's really in the second paragraph maybe, where you write that having a child made you realize that a child couldn't be all you left behind in the world. And I don't know if that was shocking to me because you were so unapologetic about that, whereas when women write about that, there's a lot more hand-wringing around that realization. Or if it shocked me because it was the reason why you then seek out this extraordinarily dangerous situation. So I wanted to ask you about that startling moment and how you came to the realization that a child was not all you wanted to leave behind, and whether you felt any trepidation or guilt or anxiety about then subjecting yourself to the dangers that might mean your daughter would grow up without a father.
Sure,
I'm not trying to dad shame you. I just really was. I really was so taken aback by that moment. It was extraordinary.
I think my sense was a lot of parents might feel this, and I wrote about it. I explored a little in a little more detail. So I thought maybe I could read a couple more just paragraphs about my relationship with Raphael and my feelings as I set off on the journey. Raphael and I invented a game that gave her a sense of her own strength. She kicked my face and I crashed into the wall. Delighted, she gurgled. Nat interrupted us suddenly, entering our room. She had dug up the name of a Bangui journalist. She handed me a slip with his contact information. It was the research she had mentioned in the car. That tension had culminated and was gone. Each preparation brought home the journey's risk. She just stood there. I got up and embraced her. That midnight in the basement, I read about Inuit seal hunts. The book had belonged, along with most of our library, mounted on the basement's wall, to Nat's father. He had died of a heart attack before I met Nat. I read the book as a way of invoking someone older, wiser, an ancestor. I prefer to spend such moments of acute fear in the company of the dead, in reading the classics, or listening to old music. I turned down the lights and played his Johnny Cash vinyl on the gramophone. I danced by myself, flailing my limbs. I felt haunted by Acadia's bright skies and by the joy of birth. My relationship with Raphael was nascent, and it was a time of a kind of annihilation in me. Suddenly, I felt double in the world, and at the time, as if a part of me had been consumed, that I had given up myself. Her eyes were expressive. I felt her birth brought my death into the world. She raised the question of what I left behind when I was gone. So I felt a thrill at her presence, along with a void, the sense of death, as well as the opening to immortality. This paradoxical experience of procreation was charged, euphoric, troubling. Nat saw me off the door when my taxi arrived. I left while Raphael was still asleep in her crib. And in that last moment when I stepped out, I felt overcome. I was now a father who left his family and went to work, who was absent. There was no stepping back in. And so, yes, that's somehow... Yeah.
Right, but it's so interesting to say that the child makes you feel your mortality. The child makes you feel the possibility of your own death, and then you go seek your own death in the Central African Republic. So talk to me about that paradox, because that's another kind of paradox, to feel your death and instead of fearing it, to kind of run headlong into its arms.
Sure, there's so many layers to that question. So the work, her birth made me want to seek some kind of work that felt elemental, that felt necessary. Why do I seek out this kind of work? Often I do this kind of reporting in these dangerous places, not because of the danger, not because I want to go to the danger, but because the danger makes it so that these stories are not reported. I'm now living in Mexico City. I'm reporting on environmental defenders, indigenous environmental defenders, incredibly, incredibly brave people, like far braver, like 100 times braver than anything that I've ever even thought of attempting. They're risking their lives, their family, their land, everything to protect mountains, rivers, forests. And what drives me to go there is that I feel these defenders deserve more attention in the press, and yet for a variety of reasons they don't get featured in the press. For their poverty, there's class issues. For colonialism, back in the day, they were sent to the most remote areas, so it's very difficult actually physically to show up there. And then the third reason is there's racism. There's just not a tradition, as there isn't in this country or in Canada, of writing about these communities, because it invokes questions of how these countries were founded and all these complicated questions that haven't been addressed and haven't been addressed internally or in the history textbooks in schools, and so nobody wants to talk about that. And so I feel that there's merit, and I can again be useful. I can do something useful by going to these places and raising their profiles, and in doing so, get them some protection and get the environment, in this case in Mexico. And so that's why I sought out this work in the Central African Republic. I sought out work that felt deeply, deeply meaningful. And this war, at the time, it was so similar to the Syrian war. The death toll felt similar, the history, the scale of the war. And Syria was all over the press, and this war was nowhere. And so I thought, this is, and just to, share some of the experience of going to the war, even though I know we're going to extremely dangerous places, I do so with a great sense of humility, and I rely on the people around me. Often I hear about, so this is how it usually works. I'll hear about something, a massacre, some killing somewhere. There's not much information. Nobody knows who did it, why, who was killed, because it's too dangerous to get there. And then I feel as a journalist, I begin to plan to try and get as close as I can. Not to get there, but to get as close as I can. And so along the way, at every stop, every tea stall or every meal, I'm talking to the people around me and asking them, is it safe to go a little bit further? And sometimes they'll say, oh, we heard an army convoy moving last night, and that's usually a sign that something is happening. And so in that case, I have to again, be super humble and say, I'm going to wait here 3 days and do more research or turn back. And you always have to be willing to do that. Otherwise, you put yourself in incredible danger, and you're not doing the work. And so there's always that tension, and so it doesn't feel. I know it can seem dangerous. Compared to the people I'm reporting on, it isn't that dangerous. They're taking far more risk than I am. So I feel compelled to take a little bit of risk to help their cause. And number two, it's done with great care, and you have to be very, very careful. Otherwise, you can end up dead. And I've obviously have friends and colleagues who unfortunately have been in the wrong place at the wrong time or just made mistakes. And
one of the kind of arcs that this book follows is the movement from the intimacy of the family to the intimacy that you share with the people that you report with, or who help you report. For instance, Lewis, who you were talking about. Thierry, a number of other characters who become like family, or who witness you doing the kinds of things that only family tends to witness. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different kinds of intimacy that we find in this book, the intimacy that one shares with a wife and a child, versus the intimacy that one shares with, members of Human Rights Watch who are helping you do the reporting, or the nurses from Doctors Without Borders or the Red Cross that are helping get medical supplies to the rebels who have been injured. What are the different valences of intimacy that we're seeing in this book?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And the interesting thing about this trip, it reminds me that Lewis was also a new father, had just become a father. And I just spent last month, 2 weeks with Rafael, my daughter, at Lewis's home in Vermont.
Can you just tell everyone who Lewis is in
Sorry,
case they...
yes, so Lewis Mudge, he's my companion on the journey. He's American, he's from Boston, and now lives in Vermont. And he's now the Central African Director for Human Rights Watch, but back then he was a researcher. And we're we're still very close friends. And we became friends in Rwanda because my second book, which is Bad News, which is here, is about class of journalists whom I taught in Rwanda, 12 journalists. They were taken out by the Rwandan government one by one as I was teaching them, shot dead, imprisoned, forced to flee the country. And this book is, I tried to tell their stories. I hid one of my students in my house and got him out of the country. And I try to sort of honor their work. And Lewis was researching for Human Rights Watch. He was researching all these disappearances, torture, people in prison, and so we would hang out, drink scotch at his house, and share our stories. And he was one of the few people in the country with whom I could speak openly, and I was that person for him. And I just spent 2 weeks at his place last month with my daughter, and I got to spend a lot of time with his wife, Nikki, for the first time since that journey. And Nikki said to me, Lewis, after they have 3 kids, and after every kid, in the first couple of months, he just disappears. And that's what he does. That's not his moment. He's a super dad right now. He's like, he takes care, he's running the household. He's taking the kids to their horse riding classes or whatever, or to school. But in those first few months, he's absent.
Well, isn't that convenient for him? Yeah.
But I guess we were both processing what it meant to become fathers on this journey. Thierry, who was the Central African reporter, they call them fixers, but really they're the heart of the team. They know the country far better than any of us who are flying in. They've reported on these wars and conflicts for a decade often. The team and the project is really built around them, and they don't get enough credit. This is why I'm spending a bit of time on Thierry Mesongo. He's a local journalist. They don't get enough credit. Often the foreign correspondent comes in, extracts a lot of information from them, gets all the credit, gets all the bylines, gets the prizes, and often these journalists, it's happening less and less now, but it's still not enough, and they don't get enough credit for the way in which they influence which stories you report on, where you go, how you report on them, the subtleties of the situation of the conflict. Thierry was using this trip to earn money for his wedding. He was engaged and he didn't have enough money to afford a wedding, and so we were all in these very intimate, personal situations. And there's a funny story. We reached the front line, and we got back to our rooms at a school actually, and we turned on the internet, and we had these satellite phones. And our internet was blocked. We couldn't get any information, and we wondered if Human Rights Watch had sent us like maps or information about some other massacre somewhere that we needed to report on. But it was Nikki who'd sent these baby photos to Lewis, and high resolution baby photos, and she had no idea that our bandwidth was limited, and so we got these giant images of Lewis's kid. We had to text her and say, we can't be doing this. This is our life and death here. Our bandwidth is crucial. And yes, at the end of the trip, I guess, the reason, again, to come back to why we make these journeys, it's really in all these conflicts, you meet these heroes. You meet people, extremely dangerous situations, taking great risk. And so one of them in the west of the country was a priest, a Polish priest, whose name is Mirek. And we arrived in the west of the country, and he said, this town had been attacked 100 kilometers to the north, and you had to pass through extremely dangerous rebel territory to get there. But the soldiers who had attacked the town, they'd attacked the church, and they'd stolen the door for the wood. And so Mirek, the abbot, said, I'm going to go there and replace the door to show, because the priest is now sleeping in the open, the altar's in the open, and I need to show the rebels that, that there are people supporting him. And so I asked if we could go with him, and we traveled across this very, very dangerous territory, and at every village we would stop, Mirek would honk, and the village was empty, and somebody would come running out with a piece of paper and shove it through the window into my lap, and in neat handwriting would be a list of names of people who had been killed, who were sick, what they needed, what food they needed, what medicine, and we would go from town to town, collect these pages, and then he brought them back to the capital, the regional capital, and he would hand them to the NGOs, the nonprofit organizations, and tell them where help was needed, what kind of help was needed. And I said to Mirek, you're a journalist, and he said, I don't publish anywhere, I don't have a byline. But he was doing the work. This is how war correspondence is done. It blew my mind in the 21st century, in the age of Twitter, with we believe we have too much information, but there are these completely, black zones where such crucial, vital information doesn't get out, and it's only because of their heroism that basic information, life and death information gets out.
And it's a rosewood door, isn't it, that he replaces it with? Am I remembering that correctly? That was a very striking detail in the book to me. Talking about information and communication and the speed with which one communicates. Another interesting arc in the book for me was that you start with that story, which we all heard, about how you and Nat met because she would send you information about the attacks before they would happen, so that you could have a kind of jump on the other journalists in publication. So there's a kind of speed of communication and a synchronicity of communication that's going on. But then part of the story that you tell with you going away is how the communication between the two of you breaks down. You can't get through to her over the phone. When you do, she doesn't want to speak, or she's with the baby. She doesn't want you to go to the more dangerous parts of the country, so you don't email her until you decide that you're going to go back home. And so part of the story that you're telling is a breakdown in communication on two fronts, right? The breakdown in communication that can happen in a relationship, and the lack of communication that results in certain kinds of journalistic heroics, old-fashioned journalistic heroics. So can you talk a little bit about the tension between those two things in this book?
Wow, I had not even, it didn't occur to me. All these things that I guess a great and close reader, brings to you. And so I hadn't considered this. But yes, I guess the opening story that you mentioned, it was a very special relationship that she would send me news of these, the news before it was broadcast. And I would type it up and send it to the AP, and the AP would call me up and say, Anjan, you've only been in Congo for like a month. How are you beating the Reuters guy and the BBC guy? I've been there for years. I was like, I'm just that good, And, obviously it was her sending me all these stories. So I got my early foothold and got my break with her help. And indeed, yeah, I guess, I have to think about like how the communication broke down. Part of what gave me confidence and what I tried to convey even in the passages that I read was that she had been a war correspondent herself. And so she understood intimately, she'd done it herself on the front line of the war in Congo. That's where we met. She understood what this job entailed. And she, helped me. She got me the contact of Thierry, the Central African reporter. And she was very encouraging that, we discussed before we had a child that I would continue this work, or I might, and that we would discuss it, obviously. But the idea was for me to continue it, and for her as well to continue it. And obviously, she chose not to. But she was very supportive, and that was crucial. I think to do this kind of work, what I wanted to convey was that to do this kind of work, at least in my case, and I think a lot of reporters, need a strong family, need strong personal relationships. You need an anchor. You need some place to turn back to. Like when I was describing driving into these dangerous places and always being willing to turn back, you need some place to go back to. And even if you don't go back there, that place is home, and you need a very solid sense of home that you feel you can return to if you're going to go out and put yourself out in these places. At least I felt that, and I tried to convey that in the beginning of the story. And yes, towards the end, towards the middle, as you describe, and in the end, the work, as happens so often with reporters and frontline human rights workers, it damages and then destroys the marriage. And for how the communication breakdown. So my ex-wife Nat, she's also an author. She's also a journalist. I would love to read her memoir. For what happened at the end, because I still don't understand, how things changed so much. There was a total breakdown in communication. I felt like I didn't understand what she wanted, and it moved from a relationship that was built on very good and intimate communication to one where we couldn't find the words. And yeah. Yeah.
Maybe this is too probing of a question, but was there ever a discussion about you staying at home with Raphael and her going back to the front lines?
So that had been the idea. That had been the idea that I would make this journey, and then we would go back to Central Africa, where she was working at the UN, and she had taken maternity leave, and that she would go back for a contract, and I would follow her as she did her job. and that had been the plan, and everything kind of broke down. Yeah. Uh, I think partly, after we had the child, she decided she wanted to stay at home, and I didn't quite understand that. And she's still there 10 years later. Our daughter's 10. She's still at home in this very small village in New Brunswick on the Atlantic coast of Canada. And that's where she decided to move. And I guess, they say having a kid changes you, and, or can. And in her case, it very explicitly did, in ways that I thought by then we had been together for 9 years. I thought she was one of the best people I knew best in the world, and it was inexplicable what happened. But a lot of huge life events. I think this kind of work can be difficult to process or integrate into a regular family life. I think that's what she began to want.
I wonder, the events that you write about in Bad News, you published Bad News fairly shortly after the events that you describe in Bad News happened, but you waited about 9 years to describe the events in Breakup. And I'm curious if you felt like you needed that time in order to tell these two stories together, the story of the marriage and the story of your reporting in the Central African Republic, or if there was some other reason why you wanted to sit on that story until you were ready to share it with other people.
It's a very important question. I tried to write this book for many years, 7 years. It was published 9 years after the events happened. And I think the aspect I found most difficult about this book was I wanted to convey the beauty of the marriage in the beginning of the book. I wanted to convey the nature of the intimate, the fusional bond that Nat and I shared that allowed me to do this kind of work. And it took me a long time to be able to remember, recall, and write about the beauty of the marriage without feeling resentful that I had lost it. Because I felt that with Nat, I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. That's why we had a child. And to lose that and then write about it was extremely hard. It wasn't to write about the breakup at the end. That came quite easily. That's quite easy to write about. Yeah. But to write about the beauty and to recall how it was in the beginning. Because a lot of the events in Bad News and in Breakup, I felt that I could do because I could be extremely vulnerable before her. And when I was, the relationship was such that she didn't cut me down. She made me feel that I could be larger than I was, than I knew I could be. Even when I was reporting on the journalists in Rwanda, I remember calling her up at one point and saying to her, the government might come after me in the same way they've gone after the journalists. Do you think I should continue? And she was like, nah, nothing's going to happen. Don't worry. Keep going. You're overthinking it. Yeah. And I found those moments so important. And again, when I went to the war in the Central African Republic in Breakup, she helped me find a local reporter, Thierry, who could help me conduct my reporting more safely and in a more deeply. And so she was extremely important to who I was. And I like I said, I felt there was a period when I felt I resented having lost that. It was for me the perfect marriage, and I resented having lost that. But I wanted to convey that, and so that's what took so long to be able to convey who she was, how beautiful it was, what we shared.
That's very lovely. That's very moving. Do you feel like now that you are reporting from a different part of the world, are you in Mexico City right now, or you're in Mexico City, writing on environmental activism? Very different from being in the Central African Republic reporting on a war there. Do you feel like a different version of yourself? Do these different situations, these different reporting situations, bring out different parts of you, different sympathies, different intimacies, to go back to a word we were using earlier in the conversation?
Absolutely. I think so all the books, I will eventually write a book about my time in Mexico, and so all the books combine the personal and the reported, the world. And so in Mexico it's going to be about these very brave, inspiring environmental defenders, but the personal aspect will be about my relationship with Raphael, me trying to be a father, and in some way, me trying to take care of my daughter, and these communities trying to take care of their territories. They see their families, they see their forests and rivers as part of their families, and so there's a tie there. But that's what I find beautiful about this project. I don't quite know what my relationship with Raphael is going to become. I'm trying to be a father. I'm trying to be present. I see her twice a year in Canada. She's come down. I go up. I'd like her to come down to Mexico to study, spend a year there, and so I can take care of her and be with her. I don't know if that's going to be possible. She has all her friends back home, so who knows? But that's what I find beautiful about this project. I'm living and then processing who I was. And I find it's important. It's important for this kind of work as well, in a different way. It's something I only realized recently. To see myself as a character, to see myself from the outside, helps me process some of the emotions that I internalize from these conflicts, and the difficulties of reporters talk about PTSD and stuff like that. And so in that vein, I think I find writing about myself and seeing myself from a distance helps me to continue to do this kind of work. So it's very pragmatic in that way as well.
Let me ask one more question, and then audience, I will turn to you. So please get your questions ready as I'm speaking. You see yourself as a character, but you've also turned your daughter into a character as well. And I wonder if she has had occasion to read Breakup and has, at the wise age of 10, older children, we know, are different, yes. At the wise age of 10, if she has any thoughts on how you have represented yourself or how you have represented her mother, your ex-wife.
So I can tell a few stories about how the book has been received in the family. I sent the book this year when it was nearly done, or was almost about to be published, to my ex-wife, Jeanette. And she called me up and she said, thank you for portraying me as nicer than I actually was at the time. And I was like, oh my God, this is such a relief, Because I was so scared of, I was so concerned about her reaction. So that went down well. But my daughter came to visit me stay with me for a month in December, and in Mexico City, and I'd received a proof of this book to read, to just, proof for corrections. And she saw it on my desk, and she saw the title, and she said, I know what that book's about. You should throw it in the bin. And so that was her reaction in December. And then last month, when I was in Vermont with her, I did an event, a book talk with Louis, and so we both shared our experience of the journey in Vermont, and she was sitting there. And so it was the first time that she heard me speak about the breakup, about her mom, about her. And I asked her what she thought afterwards, after the talk, and she was like, I didn't know all these people knew me. And a few months before, she told my mom, that was a change. So I think she's changed. She's come to accept the book. A few months prior, she had told my mom, I don't want to be famous. Why is Dad putting me in this book? I don't want people to know me. But at the talk, I think something changed, and she's come to accept it. And I think it was a beautiful moment to share with her. Because I could point to her. I was like, Raphael, I'm speaking about her, I'm reading about her, and she's there. And it was a different kind of intimacy, and I'll write about it in the Mexico book.
In the new one.
Exactly. It's interesting for these relationships to play out both in domestic intimacy and in private, but also in public in a certain way. And that's a choice I've made. My mom asked me before, the book came out, she was like, you haven't asked Raphael's permission.
Right.
Yeah, how do you know she's okay with this? And all these questions. My mom is, being a grandma especially, very protective. So yeah, there's all these questions, and I had to make these choices, yeah.
Well, I could talk to you forever about the ethics of reporting on one's own children and how that can be even thornier sometimes than the ethics of reporting on war. But I'm sure that our audience members have questions, so let us turn to the audience. Do we have a roving mic? Yes, we have two. I see Scott over there. Scott, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much for being here.
Wait, is it working? Nope. He says thank you.
Thank you very much for being here and telling your story. My question is coming a little bit from a different angle. You can write excellent material, but if the wire services don't pick it up, if the editor for the paper you're working for, if they don't think it's important, it doesn't get published. So how much of an issue is that, and how do you deal with those situations?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a constant, I mean, that's become part of my work. I try to write these stories that aren't in the news. And so I know I'm coming up against that even before I've begun to report it. And so I have this long history. I could speak for a long time about it. But part of what I write about in Stringer, the first book, is this gap between what I'm reporting. You know, reporters, they say, write the first draft of history. And so if I'm reporting all these stories from the Congo, and there only certain stories get published, stories about, plane crashes, or there's a scene in the book where I call my editor up and say, there's a huge protest, 100 Congolese women are protesting in front of the UN because there's an epidemic of rape, and some of them have been raped. Some of the UN officers have been, have raped them, and nobody's been held accountable. And they're protesting, and my editor says, "Well, any shooting? No. Anybody dead? No." He's like, "Nah, not interesting." And so, so that's a particular kind of story that's reported, and yet I write a lot about the family I lived with, Nona and Jose, and the Congolese family I was living with, Annie's relatives, and the stories that there was a baby in the house, a 3-year-old baby, and the stories that Nana would pass down to her child were very different from the stories I was reporting. And so it created this sort of, this big question in my mind. If I'm writing the first draft of history and representing Congo to the world, why is it so different from the Congo that's being shared or spoken of within homes that Congolese are telling each other? And so, there is a huge difference. And part of the reason I like to write these books is to share those stories and find an outlet for them, because in the media it's hard. And for the Mexican environmental defenders, I wrote to one of major newspapers, and I asked if I could write a story about them, and they said, "Oh, well, we published something on this 4 years ago. We published something about environmental defenders 4 years ago, and then indigenous defenders in Colombia 2 years ago. So I think we're good." And so,
Right. No, that's. It's not just that the stories don't get enough space. It's that the saturation point is lower for these kinds of stories in at least Anglophone, English language news media than it is for other kinds of stories. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Other questions from the audience? Someone be brave. Yes, thank you. Come on up.
Oops.
So I have a question slightly different. This is on the war reporting, and you've been in the front lines and are, which is, by the way, very commendable. I read news all the time, and I'm always amazed at these reporters from these newspapers and other media as well in these front lines, really telling very good stories. And in fact, sometimes I even feel that they seem to be like the lone voice from wilderness shouting at us. The question I have in this war reporting is that you see two sides of human nature. You see incredible humanity in the descriptions that you just mentioned. And then you also have incredible evil that perpetrates these violence, unspeakable. And they both coexist. And I wonder, are there times when you reflect how humanity could be that far apart while being so close to each other? I wonder if you have any thoughts. I know this is it's off from what you've been talking about.
I guess I don't see it quite in that way. I mean, to do this kind of work, you have to come from a moral position of knowing that there is beauty in all these situations. Even in the most dire situation, that you're going to find these heroic characters. And I can share maybe one character, one person, this warlord in his story, a warlord, Matthew Ngojolo. He was a warlord in the east of Congo. And I went and met him, and he went to The Hague. He was tried at The Hague. I believe he was convicted, found guilty of all kinds of unspeakable crimes. But when I met him, he told me that he had been a nurse for the Red Cross, and that he had become a fighter and a warlord because one day these rebels stormed into his house and raped his daughters. And and he said, nobody's protecting me, and so I need to do it. And so it began with very noble intentions to protect his community, and he created this militia, and then they got powerful, and then too powerful, and then went to his head. He hadn't been trained. He has nobody taught him how to be a warlord. And so once you have that kind of power, and the government's almost absent, you start to commit all these crimes. And so you find these both sides in the same person sometimes, and a lot of what motivates me is the certainty that when I'm going to these places, I'm going to find people like Mirek, or there was another priest, Angela, an Italian priest, Merve mentioned her. She was sheltering 3,000 people in her church, and the government said they're going to attack and kill all those people, and she essentially made herself a human shield. She said, "I'm not." I asked her, "Are you going to leave?" And she said, "No, I'm staying." And then our team, Thierry, Louis, and I were like, "I don't think we can leave now. It just looks bad."
Well, and the flip figure to the warlord are the child soldiers that you encounter in this book too, who really aren't. You can't see the child soldiers as purely evil. I mean, they are innocents conscripted into doing something terrible, but usually for their own salvation, to save themselves. So
indeed, and this child soldier Merve's speaking of, I asked him his name, and he said, "My name is Tony Montana." And because I aspired to be as cruel as Al Pacino and Scarface, and he was killed shortly afterwards because the war turned and his side lost, and but absolutely you can't see it's very difficult to see a child as evil. You have to question, how did this child end up here? What is motivating them? Who recruited them? What stories were they told? What do they believe?
Hi, thank you so much for sharing some really vulnerable things here. My question is sort of about your politicization story, a personal story and journey, having come from Yale and Goldman Sachs, and now, can you relate to those colleagues? How do you kind of, when you come back home, you talked about home as being a comforting place, but I think there's also this, a truth in that the liberal left and those of us that think we are thinking on behalf of those less privileged, the oppressed, minoritarian, those who have sort of lives that maybe we want to uplift, as sort of being disingenuous in some ways, because are we putting ourselves on the line, and how much are we willing to give up? And what I find fascinating about your story is that in some ways you kind of were willing to escape the numbness of a comfortable life. Granted, you were able to come back to it, but I'm just curious in terms of how that's shaped your social worlds and your relatability when you do come back to the Yales and the Goldman Sachs. And
do you still have banker friends?
Yeah, and do you feel a frustration, or do you even feel like you want to proselytize and shake them up and wake them up in any way?
No, I don't really see myself. I think I could be very unpopular if I started to do that, right? Have no friends. and I guess how it plays out now is I'm living in Mexico City, which is an incredibly trendy city. Every time I come back from one of these reporting trips, I have culture shock. I'm going to some very fine tea house and being served like Thai sweets by some, it's like incredible. And I've just come from a place where a community is fighting drone wars against cartels to protect a mountain, and these kids who are not trained to be soldiers are manning anti-aircraft guns and putting their lives on the line. So I guess what I said a little bit earlier might capture it. I don't see myself, even though I understand that relative to the person at Yale, I'm taking a lot of risk. I don't see myself as taking that much risk when I'm there. I'm very careful. I've been doing this now for 18 years. I think there are ways to stay safe, and the places I'm going to, for example, this base where these drone wars are being fought, you know, it looked like a parking lot. I turned the corner and it looked like the room in the Matrix. There were like anti-aircraft guns, drones, walkie-talkies. I sat down with the commander. I was like, you know, where does the cartel attack? He says, here. I'm like, here? He's like, yeah, here. I was like, how often do they attack? He's like, every 2 days. When was the last attack, obviously? And he's like, well, they sent 4 drones carrying C4 explosives mounted on motorheads this morning. They didn't drop them on us, but they'll be back. And this guy gets off his hammock, you know, loads his rifle and says, estamos listos, no? We're ready to fight these guys. And so I was there for an hour and a half, you know, interviewing these guys, and they're sleeping there, they're living there. It's just, there's no comparison to the level of risk. And so I just see myself as a bridge and trying to go out there, get these stories out. And part of what gives me a sense of purpose is trying to get these stories into the mainstream. So the question that was earlier, I want to get these stories into the New York Times, into the mainstream discourse, and it's not there. And so I have to understand both sides. And so I can't see myself as, you know, outside one. And so I'm also a product of, you know, Yale and, you know, coming from India. So that's also, I mean, if I can say, I think that's why I like the form of the memoir. I am writing from a place of subjectivity. Often journalists write or say they aspire to some kind of objectivity, right? But I like to write about who I am, present who I am. I'm a man, I'm from India, I went to Yale. And therefore I'm drawn to certain stories and I have certain blind spots. And I like to present this to the reader and say, come with me on the journey if you want to, but I'm not pretending to give you something objective. Obviously I'm reporting the truth, what I'm seeing, but I do have blind spots. There are things that I'm not going to be able to convey so well. And if you're willing to accept that subjectivity, come with me. And the other reason I like writing in the first person is a lot of journalists and a lot of accounts of places are written from a place of authority. I've been in this place for 2 years, 3 years, or whatever, or sometimes 3 months. Let me tell you about this place. Let me inform you. Let me educate you. And I like to start my stories at the point at which I knew almost nothing about the country. I like to write not from a place of authority, but from a place of ignorance. Because all these countries, I'm not from there, there was a point at which I knew almost nothing. And I like to start the story there and invite the reader and say, hey, if you want to come on this journey with me, if you're interested, here's why I'm interested. If you want to come on the journey, you can sit on my shoulder and we travel together. And so that's really part of the purpose of writing in this form.
Well, if you would like to sit on Anjan's shoulders, not literally, but I don't know, maybe literally, he will be signing books downstairs. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was wonderful, extremely inspiring. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks.